Yeah, don't flex in public, Jim. Alright, so yeah, that was the original Sega screen. I prefer the Sega CD versions. This, of course, it's more elaborate, but that one's nice too as well. Alright, everybody, so welcome to the extra part of Earthworm Jim. Thank you, Silenig, whatever. I'll post the link in the description.
Yeah, the description.
The point is, he makes great long plays of games where he literally plays both versions side by side. That's an amazing work that he does, because this, I can only imagine. There you go. Here's how the startup screen is on the Super Nintendo. Notice something missing?
The music.
Not just that, Notice how he didn't do the so what happened? Did those sound clips got lost in the port?
Or they were too heavy, even compressed, because that, I think, was the problem of the Super Nintendo. It couldn't have that much audio into it.
Alright.
That's one of the reasons why a lot of ports on the Super Nintendo actually lack audios here and there. Okay. Also, I guess the Super Nintendo version has that image for the loading screens before it actually starts.
The one thing I will give the Super Nintendo version, I do like how the music of the stage already starts during the title screen and then just continues playing even when you start the level. Whereas in the Mega Drive version, you hear the main theme, and then when you get to the level, it's the level theme starts. That's actually a much better transition, I would argue. Anyway, so yeah, this is New Junk City on both platforms. As you can see, obviously, since the Mega CD Special Edition was based on the Mega Drive version, obviously it looks the same as well. The Super Nintendo port, on the other hand, as you can see, it's like J.J. Abrams is on the background using his lens flare.
I mean, doesn't look that bad, but it
definitely looks
a
bad.
lot brighter.
I'm not saying it looks bad, it's just that it feels like overexposed film, you know what I mean? Like, it feels like unnecessary. I kind of prefer the look of the original, because I think it fits the atmosphere of the game better, whereas that one looks a bit too distractingly bright. Maybe just because I played the original version first, I guess, but at the same time, I don't know.
I'm fine with that, though.
It seems like there are different times of the day. Like, well, the one to the left looks like it's a moonlit night, whereas the one to the right looks like it's in the middle of the day.
It also doesn't help that importing. It also doesn't help that importing the game to the Super Nintendo, the music was. Let's just say the music didn't transition well, as you guys can probably hear. Compare the Super Nintendo version of the New Junk City theme sounds quite empty and shallow, especially compared to the Mega Drive version that we're about to hear after this. Just trust me, if
it was only the Super Nintendo version on its own, it would be serviceable as a soundtrack.
Yeah.
But considering the origin of it and the system tied to it, yeah, there's no real comparison.
Like, the SNES one doesn't even sound bad, it's just the Mega Drive one is that much better sounding.
Alright. It's just because, first of all, the first Super Nintendo version sounds muffled compared to this one that we're hearing right now, the Mega Drive version. This one also, you can tell there's certain instruments that were taken out of the Super Nintendo version. Again, I'm guessing the port was rushed, so there was no, not to mention, like I said, it's so abundantly clear that when Tommy composed this, he was thinking of the Genesis sound chip. So obviously it would be really hard to transition this to the Super Nintendo's hardware, which was very different. That's my guess, at least. Alright. Look at that sprite animation. Alright. So yeah, I think it's abundantly I think it's pretty obvious which version of the song is better. Like, the Mega Drive just it has a lot more going for it. Like, it has a lot more spice to it, especially when we get to the upcoming part in a moment, when we get to that one little bit. I'll mention it when it does show up. There you go. Well, at least I can say that the sprite looks like it didn't suffer anything, I guess.
True.
Well,
true.
I mean, normally sprites did not suffer. Okay.
To be fair,
that is one thing. Let me finish.
Sorry.
That is one thing. Also, it's like sprite quality rarely, if ever, suffered. In fact, if there's one thing the SNES did often have over the Mega Drive or Sega Genesis, it was that sometimes it could have more fidelity in its graphics. Like if you compare the graphics in Lion King on the SNES to the Mega Drive one, you'll see that certain animals and whatnot have better quality looks to them in the SNES one.
Mm-hmm.
Even in general, Jova, technically speaking, both consoles had the same powerhouse in 16 in terms of being on 16-bit processing. So
But
I
the
guess
blast
the difference the difference were really minimal.
Well,
The Genesis Mega Drive had the advantage of coming out way before the Super Nintendo is still holding for so many years, despite Nintendo having to release a better console to go up against it. But the Super Nintendo actually managed to stay alive after the end of the Genesis and got a lot of exclusive games. So
to be fair, I wouldn't call the differences in the architecture minimal between the two. Like they still do have notable different things. It's like, basically think about it like comparing the PS4 to the Xbox One in the sense like, they have, basically similar capabilities and whatnot, but there was definitely differences.
Yeah, this version of Nightfall Mountain was bad, but
yeah, the Mega. This is actually one of those because the Super Nintendo is whereas the Mega Drive is much better with the rockin' tunes. Obviously, the Super Nintendo is much better with the orchestral stuff. So the Super Nintendo version of Night on the Bald Mountain is, of course, sounds quite better than the original Mega Drive version. Fortunately, since we can play the Sega CD version, we can just get an even better version. I wouldn't say it's so much that the SNES was lacking in the rock because it had stuff like the Mega Man X games on it. More like, the problem was like when it came to tunes that, were specifically made for being 8-bit and 16-bit sounding. The Mega Drive had the SNES beat, whereas SNES was going for more the instrumental tunes until it came up with certain ways to circumvent those issues. Another thing that I'll have to give credit to the Super Nintendo version is there's a new background that they added into this port.
It's a nice background.
And it's a background that is exclusive to the Super Nintendo version. When they made the special edition in the following year, they didn't add in this background. I'm guessing they were prioritizing more in terms of adding the new content rather than porting every single little minor thing, which I guess it's fine. But at the same time, I kind of wish this background would have been put there because it does help instead of it's better than just having a black background.
Yeah.
I mean, there you go. See, and you can see the Sega CD version looks the same.
I mean, there's nothing inherently wrong with it. It just looks nicer.
And here's another example with the Super Nintendo version. I think
the SNES one definitely has the better looking level for this one.
Yeah, don't get me wrong. The orange background in the Mega Drive and Mega CD does look fine enough. There's nothing particular. It's not that there's anything inherently wrong with it. It's just that when it comes to color contrast, I prefer the Super Nintendo background. I actually also think it looks more artistically pleasing, to be honest.
Yeah, I was gonna say I prefer the artwork.
That looks like a desktop wallpaper.
Also, for some reason in the Sega Genesis version, there's something inside the planet in the distance moving.
It's similar, but it's to recreate the effect on Jupiter, Jove. If you don't remember, Jupiter is a gas planet, meaning there are storms constantly roaming around the surface. I think that's the intended effect.
I only just noticed that.
I get that, but it looks more like a globe that you're looking into a reflection of as opposed to that.
True.
Granted, limitations. It's just, it looks weird.
All right. There we go.
And yes, the color contrast is a lot better considering how chaotic this level can get.
Yeah, again, as someone who grew up with the Mega Drive version, there's nothing inherently wrong. I mean, the Mega Drive colors work just fine. It's just that, again, it's just one of those cases where it's more artistically pleasing. So yeah, I kind of wish they would have kept these colors in the special edition as well. However, like I said, it's just one of those things where my guess is when it comes to making a special edition, they were more focused. They focused their resources more on actually adding new content rather than minor little cosmetic changes, I guess. So I guess I can understand that.
And listening to the soundtracks back to back, I kind of favor the SNES one of this over the Mega Drive version.
Yeah, this is Bose Analyst. So yeah, obviously, this is one of those cases where the Super Nintendo has the better hardware for it. Of course, the better version is still the Sega CD version, since it's the actual proper soundtrack with the instruments. But yeah, if you have to pick between these two, the Super Nintendo has the better track in this one. The Mega Drive version is still the overall better version of these two, because remember, it has one more level that the Super Nintendo version doesn't have. And the music, and even though there are some pieces of music that are better on the Super Nintendo, most of the soundtrack is better on the Genesis, especially the themes for Buttville, as we're gonna hear in a moment. There you go. There we go. Yeah, that kind of juggling through. I can't do that. I'm sorry. Selenig, you play this game way better than I do. I could never do that.
Why is the background different for the PC version?
Okay, this is the PC port of Earthworm Jim by Rainbow Hearts. Don't play this port. Why? The controls were butchered. Trust me, if you grew up with this game and you play the PC version, you'll immediately feel the difference.
The frame rate looks atrocious.
It does, yeah. It was the sad part too. Rainbow Arts ported the two original games, and released them as a package, and their port of Earthworm Jim 2 is fine enough. So
what happened here?
I don't know. Anyways, here's Falling, aka the first theme of Buttville, on the Mega Drive, and after that we'll listen to the Super Nintendo version. There you go. See, this is how I first got introduced to Earthworm Jim. I was looking for games to buy, and I saw this on the shelf, and I thought, wow, this looks cool. Look, there's a sluggy thing, and there's a cow, apparently. Okay.
This is weird.
But this looks cool.
Sega has finally come a long way since those atrocious covers of I forgot the name. The Master System. There you go.
Oh no, the artwork on a lot of Mega Drive covers was pretty damn good. This one included Dr. Naple.
Sonic being basically the poster.
Dr. Naple, as you can see for this artwork, Dr. Naple is a great artist. I mean, there's a lot of personality just on these drawings alone.
A thing that a lot of people may have forgot these days is that covers are important in selling the game, because the people who don't follow the news, even with the internet and everything, they tend to enter the gaming shop. They, like Pedro just said, they look at the cover and said, "This looks cool, I wanna buy it." That actually is a percentage of your buyers for the game.
For example,
so having a good cover is important for your game, and a lot of games these days have this generic dude standing with his back and a gun on his right arm.
Sometimes on the top of a mountain.
Yes.
To be fair, the more minimalistic covers are normally in Japan and Europe.
True. The minimalistic Final Fantasy covers, I would argue.
And I really love those actually. Just the logo on the on the white background, which is sadly a tradition that got broken with Final Fantasy 13. Thanks again, Toriyama.
Hey, if it's any consolation, we got a better looking cover.
I do like the compromise in 15 where you can do an American
cover. Oh, hold on. Anyway,
alright, so as you can see, Falling on the Mega Drive sounds awesome because, again, that's Genesis sound chip that gives that awesome electronic sound. And once again, the Super Nintendo version, it kind of sounds shallow by comparison, if you ask me.
It just doesn't give the same power.
I can't really hear it over the helicopter.
This is unfortunately one thing with the SNES. While it had better sound quality, it had lower sound range in the sense that, well, compared to the volume width of the Sega Genesis, the SNES's tunes were muffled. No beating around the bush there. They were much more muffled. It seems to just
outright remove some layers of the track.
For exclusives, composers actually went around to doing that, like for the squared, so-called Trinity of JRPGs of the Super Nintendo, Chrono Trigger, Final Fantasy VI, and Secret of Mana. The respective composers actually went around and created tunes specifically adapting them for the Super Nintendo chip, and that's why they're so memorable, despite being on that system. But for ports like this, just didn't work.
Fortunately, by the time they started making Earthworm Jim 2, they were already taking into account the fact that they had to make a Super Nintendo port. So Tommy composed the soundtrack for the second game already with both sound chips in mind. So he produced tracks that would be fitting for both consoles.
That's nice.
You gotta wonder what the procedure was like back then compared to now, because whereas nowadays tunes are more elaborate sounding, ironically enough, they're a lot easier to put onto games than back then, and they probably had to first make an actual tune with actual instruments, then transpose it into what people were calling video game music bits at the time.
Composing for... Oh, sorry, go ahead.
It actually has to do with the background of these developers. Remember, David and his team, before this, were already making Mega Drive exclusives like Cool Spot, the Aladdin game that we've already did, all that good stuff. And this game was also intended by the developers as a Mega Drive exclusive, but then the publisher, Playmates, did say, actually, we want you to also port this to the Super Nintendo because we want as many versions out there as possible. For the record, there was also a Game Boy port of this, the original Game Boy.
Yeah, don't bother.
Well, actually, it's actually a pretty good port. The only real major downgrade is the graphics, obviously, but outside of that, the gameplay was very well transitioned considering the circumstances. I'll give them credit on there. It was done by Eurocom, one of
the guys who did Crash Bash.
Oh, trust me, Teo. Eurocom was a lot better back in these days.
I've seen.
It's not even terrible.
Thanks to Nitro Red, I've seen that Eurocom has developed a lot of interesting things.
Yeah, they have. I'll be sure to also show some of them myself because they made Spot Goes to Hollywood, which is a sadly very underrated game on the Mega Drive.
Well, part of that had to do with the fact that the original Cool Spot game was kind of reviled.
It wasn't reviled at all. I mean, it got a sequel for crying out loud. I mean,
well, Pedro, even
also,
games that were
Queen's
got
Luck
sequels back in the
also,
day.
the Queen's Luck for a Bot actually doesn't scream in the Super Nintendo version.
No, this is another.
Well, that makes sense. Well, okay.
It's more muffled.
Yeah, like the guys from Console Wars said.
Thank God for that.
Yeah, that's just the thing, Shiro. It still doesn't change the fact that sound effects were lost in translation, and that's not really and that's no good, as Sonic would say.
Also, glad to see that they kept the gore for the Super Nintendo version.
Surprisingly.
Also, they seem to touch up the art again in that last stage too.
Mm-hmm. All right, so the original ending was like this. I mean, we still have the Tex Avery Wolf. However, as you can see, it's nowhere near as well animated as in the special edition. That's because, thanks to the CD format, they had a lot more space for extra animations. So they reanimated this ending for the sake of, let's just go full Tex Avery on this shit. Because why? Because we can. So yeah.
They still kept the cow.
Well, yeah, this is of course the important ending, Shiroi. This is canon. We can't go on without this important ending. Come on. But yeah, obviously the ending is much better on the special edition on the Sega CD. So just because if you compare them side by side, it's there's just so much better animation on it. But yeah, aside from that, yeah. And another thing, the Mega Drive version of this tune also sounds pretty good. I'll give it that. The Super Nintendo version does, as we're going to hear in a moment, does sound a bit better, but... Also,
the credits are, I guess, because of outsourcing, but credits are bigger on the Super Nintendo.
That's because they remembered...
Oh, no.
What?
It doesn't really sound that great.
No, you don't like it? I think it sounds fine, but yeah.
It sounds like trumpet farts.
It's alright.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, and when you finish the game on the Super Nintendo version, this happens.
Isn't this the image? Isn't this the image that you get when you're getting to the cheat codes?
Yes.
Only worms allowed.
And then only Jim shows up. This doesn't happen in the Mega Drive version or even the special edition. I don't know what the heck this is about.
Oh yeah, that's right. No, I know why. It's the typical nightmare fuel that happened whenever somebody cheated a game back in the day.
Like with that Sonic game that does that weird mask expression.
You mean fun is infinite.
Well, that does make sense, Joe, because in both these games...
That's Sonic CD.
That does make sense, Joe, because in both these games, every time we enter a cheat code, we always hear Jim saying, cheater! So there's that. Anyway, yeah, that was the extra part, so tune in for the sequel, everybody.
See ya.
See ya.
See ya.